This presentation will consider the genesis and aesthetics of two recent works, both composed and performed in 2019. These works aim to achieve a transformational atmosphere between allographic and orthographic modes of sound encounter, and in doing so to bring to consciousness and critical consideration the atmospheres of performance and installation art and the context of their presentation, and challenge and blur the boundaries between them. The roots of my research lie in a long-standing interest in the nature of drones. Drones occupy an ontologically ambiguous state. As a musical device, whether as background texture or foregrounded as gradual process, they take their place as part of a performative allographic work. But in other contexts, when presented in the context of sound art or installation, they have the potential to exhibit the properties of orthographic work, existing as object. I'm interested in exploring this ambiguity, creating work that uses it and the potential for transformation between states to interrogate the circumstances of its own realisation and bring normally unacknowledged social structures to consciousness as we move between modes of performance and installation. In this work, I am guided by three fundamental aesthetic concepts. First is a phenomenological, materialist conception of sound, as articulated by, among others, Christoph Cox and Salome Voegelin. This approach finds one of its most celebrated realisations in Pauline Oliveros' practice of deep listening, and also in concepts of soundscape derived from Schaeffer. However, as Seth Kim Cohen argues, the attendant ideas of letting the sound be itself, an idea that may be traced back to Cage, are problematic. In encountering sound, we can never actually bypass the structures and the preconceptions that our own background and situation impose upon us, and to pretend otherwise is essentially an act of privilege. I therefore wish to create a dialectic between this approach and a more conceptual aesthetic, as embodied in Kim Cohen's idea of non-cochlear sound art, a term created in analogy with Duchamp's concept of non-retinal art. Kim Cohen cites this in an expanded sonic field, modelled after Krauss's expanded field of sculpture. I mediate these two aesthetics through the concept of atmospheres. Gernot Böhm posits atmosphere as an intersubjective aesthetic phenomenon of affordance and perception that mediates between object and subject, most readily perceived as the subject enters a space or moves between spaces. Atmospheres have an objective element in that it is possible to stage them, as in the scenography found in theatres, but they are also subjective, in that they can only be said to exist insofar as the subject is aware of them. They can thus be used to consider both the generation and reception of experience. Böhm sees all space mediated by human perception as being in some sense staged, and therefore sees atmospheres as a tool to aestheticize any human experience. The first work I shall discuss here was created for the New Lights Contemporary Piano Festival in June 2019, specifically for a concert of miniatures responding to Michael Finnis's The History of Photography and Sound. Finnis's work resonates with me on several levels, not least my personal connection with Finnissy as a former teacher. His mixing of personal and political themes, and indeed his emphasis on the fact that the personal and the political are inextricably intertwined, are also important factors for me. His memories of being in his father's darkroom chime strongly with my own, which resonate in my father's last years when Alzheimer's slowly erased his mind and his memories. Parallel to these personal concerns was a purely technical issue of how to approach a keyboard work, particularly in the context of my research interests, which tend towards sustained tones, just intonation, and durational work. All these approaches seem to be at a polar opposite to what was required in this context. A solution to this came from my experience as a performer and improviser, which in recent times has focused my attention on the idea that the process of creating the work, to some degree, is the work. Beginning from this premise, I decided that the performance element of this piece would consist of the setup of an installation-type environment, which would then continue beyond the performance as such. The use of an E-bow on a piano string to create a sustained tone has precedence in the work of Alvin Lucier, among others, and was a strategy that resonated with previous work I've created, using electric guitar, EBows, feedback and looping pedals to create texture. Having established the idea of a keyboard instrument adapted to produce continuous tone, I expanded the palette by using an electric air pump to operate a melodica. The combination of these two sound sources provided the basis for the work. Some experimentation established that a pile of 23 pennies provided enough weight to hold down a piano key, and also that sellotape, as well as effectively holding down melodica keys, would also in itself provide an interesting sound texture in the performance element. I conceived The Fade in Time as a theatrical piece. The setup of the instruments would constitute the performative element, and once this was set up, after a while, the audience would leave the auditorium and the door would be shut behind them. The personal story connected to this piece is obviously charged, but I wanted to avoid a sense of some kind of emotional catharsis being played out as performance. The theatre would consist of simple actions performed with care. My intention was that my leaving the performance space would be an indicator that the performance was over, and the audience would, after a period of ambiguity, realise this and begin to leave. But this isn't what happened. Instead, the audience remained in the space listening to the sounds, and after a while started to stand up and move not towards the exit, but towards the instruments. Having created a situation in which I performatively set up what was, in a sense, an installation rather than a conventional piece of music, I found that the audience's relationship with that situation changed. After a while, they treated the presence of the instrument as that of an installed object and no longer as a performance. This can be seen in the way people draw around the piano melodica and look at and inside the piano and even sit down to play, interacting with the setup in a way I didn't anticipate happening. What happened can be characterised as a change of atmosphere, something that would conventionally be achieved by the observer moving from one space to another, but in this case happened within a single situation. That is to say, the atmosphere transformed as the observers reconfigured their relationship with the situation in which they found themselves. What began as a performance became an object, and the audience's behaviour modulated to that which might be seen in a gallery rather than a concert hall. This experience was transformative for my approach to my creative practice. Following this, I decided to pursue these ideas in a larger scale, more complex context. The opportunity for this arose in the form of an invitation to write for Trinity Laban's contemporary music group for a concert in October 2019. The event that this work was to be included in was unusual in featuring two performing groups, between them playing a familiar kind of mixed programme of repertoire. My work, Dominic Murcott's The Harmonic Canon, and works by Haydn and Britten. The idea of a collaboration with Suzanne Lollivar arose from my concern that the event should not feature exclusively male-composed work. The CMG had recently presented the premiere of her cello concerto, Tradition Hybrid Survival. That work deals with themes of transformation and distortion in the context of the relationship between a culture, its diaspora, and its encounter with outsider influences. These ideas seemed naturally to relate to my ideas of transformation of atmosphere and creating transient ambiguity in the identity of the work and its audience, and so the idea of a reworking of material from that work developed. Conversation with Suzanne helped to solidify the concept, in particular the potentially problematic aspect of a female Anglo-Iranian composer's work being appropriated by a male European. I was already familiar with her analysis of the cultural hierarchies at work in remix culture as exemplified by non-classical. This led me to the idea of pushing this concept further and relishing rather than mitigating the issue of cultural appropriation. The discussion around these ideas and Suzanne's writing also eventually led to the idea of incorporating a DJ set as part of the performance, a mediatisation of the appropriation process that would provide a further push beyond the boundaries of conventional classical performance practice. During one of these conversations, we subjected the title Tradition Hybrid Survival to a process of repeated translation in Google Translate through the filters of Farsi, Arabic and English. What emerged from this process was the title of my work. The congregation between the induction of my divine impulse is exalted. You'll be relieved to hear that as I only have 20 minutes here, I'll hereafter abbreviate this to congregation. The work itself consisted of a number of elements. A recognisable work presented in the context of the concert and featuring performing musicians. An installed element consisting of a 4-channel drone field based on samples of the Lollivar with visual elements positioned around the performance area. A process of transformation from the performed element to the installation element, reconfiguring the audience's relationship with its environment. A mobile unit of musicians moving through the anterior spaces of the hall before the performance. A DJ set in the interval, which would feature tracks built on further distortions of the Lollivar source material, as well as other music featured in the concert. A drone installation placed in the anterior area, based on the harmonic field generated by the 4-channel installation, similar to the one I showed at the start of this presentation. And interventions, elements in the liminal spaces of the performance, between movements and during stage shifts. The aim of this multiplicity of events and forms was to create a sense of a Gestalt presence extending throughout and beyond both the extended space of the performance and the limits of its duration. The drone texture that formed the main element of the installation component was based around a recurring 2-chord motif from the Lollivar, while the visual element consisted of images made from ripped-up parts from Lollivar's score, a literal deconstruction. These were placed around the hall and would act as staging posts for the moving musicians. Here you see the layout of the hall and the staging positions overlaid, indicated by numbers in boxes. The conductor, meanwhile, was to conduct from the original Lollivar score, creating a point of rupture between expected conventions of concert performance and what was actually going on, as well as a hauntological presence of the original work. Lollivar's work features several passages of free, uncoordinated lines, and so for these sections I added figures whose pose the conductor was to adopt, a nod to the conductor's cadenza in Gubaidulina's Stimmen wer Stummen. I'll now play you an edited film of the performance, which contains most of these elements. In the hall, before the concert begins, a string group play the 2-chord Lollivar motif that underlies much of the work, establishing it in the minds of the audience. This had also been heard in the bar and anterior areas of the venue before the main hall opened. The orchestra come in and settle. The CMG players are concealed within the Haydn ensemble. Following the first movement of the Haydn comes the first intervention, which begins the process of destabilising the atmosphere of the concert. In this, the CMG players silently echo the end of the Haydn movement using breath tones and prominent key tapping. A second intervention follows the second movement, this time based on the 2-chord motif. The transition from third to fourth movement proceeds as normal. The Haydn ends and is applauded. The musicians will remain in situ as the conductor leaves the stage. Gregory Rose, the conductor for my piece, comes on stage and prepares to conduct. His downbeat is the cue for the Haydn players to leave the stage, as the CMG players begin playing a version of the Haydn slow movement the audience has recently heard. In this way, as well as my music invading Haydn's, Haydn's invades mine, and the boundaries of the concert format begin to collapse. the players are instructed to become out of sync with each other. And as the Haydn falls apart, they'll begin to move around the auditorium. Each player moves from station to station, improvising from the fragments of score wherever they are. The horn player, playing a natural horn, similarly moves around, but at each station plays essentially the same motif, drawn from Oliver's score, using whichever of a variety of crooks is placed at that station, the resultant tunings and stop notes distorting the intonation and realisation of that motif. Meanwhile, the act of clearing the stage for the next work in the programme is theatricalised, a procedure that would normally happen as a liminal activity between works or during the interval while the audience is out of the hall, becomes part of the performance. Essentially at this stage, all the acts to transform the work have been carried out. However, the sense of a transformation from a concert to an installation does not seem to manifest fully until the audience reconfigure their relationship with their environment and begin to leave their seats and move around the auditorium. The introduction of a beat-driven track from the DJ set in the bar is a signal that the interval has begun. This is the cue for the musicians to begin to leave the space, leaving only the 4-channel sound element and visual elements. The piece now moves from being a performed installation to a straightforward sound installation. From this point, the audience begins to drift away slowly. When the concert reconvenes, the stage is already reset for Dominic Mercott's The Harmonic Canon. After that performance, as the stage is reset for the final piece in the concert, there's a callback. Along with an ambient drone, the musicians can be heard off stage playing the 2-chord motif as the stage is reset, until the orchestra returns to perform the final work of the concert. So to sum up, what we have seen is a process of multiple transformations. Transformation of material, transformation of situation, and transformation of understanding and phenomenological experience. I want to end with a couple of quotes reflecting on site specificity and the idea of performed installations. These, I think, reflect two fundamental ideas that I take from this work. The idea of site specificity as a discursive commentary on its own locus, and the idea of agency given to audience, or, as I think they are more appropriately termed, auditors. My aim is to create situations in which the auditor becomes unsure of themselves, both in terms of what is happening in the immediate vicinity, but further, that this uncertainty should spread to a wider existential level and provide an affordance of reconsideration of one's reality. By staging an atmosphere of ambiguous identities and relationships in sound, I hope to stimulate a reconsideration of the situations in which we encounter sound and how those situations may transform us with them. Not in order necessarily to destroy or make redundant those situations, but to critique them and bring their functions and structures into more conscious awareness so that we may have a more measured and less subservient relationship with them.